Today, we're breaking down the highest DPS build paths for ADCs, revealing why some items dominate early, while others are only good once you have multiple items already online. We'll also explore power curves for different builds, explaining why the best late game builds might not always be the best overall builds. We'll look at cost efficiency of items, and hidden item synergies that could change the way you decide to build as an ADC. One recently buffed item might just be the new must-buy for early game dominance. Let's get into it. First, let's talk about one item power spikes. These are the items that do the most DPS to the enemy ADC when you only have your starter item. So what is the best first item you can buy? This graph shows the top 10 highest DPS first items you can buy for hitting an enemy ADC at level 5. Avatar's Parachute appears first and is the highest item on the graph, meaning it is the highest damage first item you can buy. That is quite unsurprising, as it does have 100 strength on it, which increases your auto attack damage by a lot. It is followed quite closely by the recently buffed Sunbeam Bow, an active item that drains your mana, which means you can't have it constantly on, and it may cause mana issues in the early game. But it does have mana regen on it, meaning if you're careful with its usage, it may be a viable first item, and definitely makes you a threat to the enemy team, because it is the second highest damage item an ADC can have in their first slot, which means you'll out DPS any enemy hunter with this item, as long as they don't have Avatar's Parachute. I should also mention that I modelled Sunbeam Bow's active component to only hit for half of its total damage, which is like saying you only hit one of the 2 projectiles it fires. If I modelled it at its full damage potential, it would be the highest DPS first item you could buy. Of course, there is a caveat to this graph, and that is that I am only considering the ADC's auto attacks. In a real game, you of course have access to your abilities too, which might make you consider different options to the ones I'm suggesting. But generally, ADCs do build for their auto attack damage from the start of the game, but some very specific gods may benefit from other first items. As we keep moving on, we can see Deathbringer is the third highest DPS single item for ADCs. With its high strength, crit chance, and passive, this is quite unsurprising, but even with all of that, it is still out DPS'd by Sunbeam Bow. You can see the other items here, with Kin's and Braggy's Harp coming in not too far behind, and then a quite large drop off for the rest of the items. Now that's all well and good, but we also have to consider the cost of these items. Avatar's Parachute is one of the most expensive items in the game and takes a long time for you to finish building. This is a massive issue for building Avatar's Parachute first, as yes, when you get it you will have the highest DPS first item possible, but the enemy ADC will finish their item long before you, and during that time they will have a finished item while you don't. It gives them a much higher chance to kill you, and generally be a much bigger threat, pushing you under tower so you lose gold to minions, and giving them the freedom to invade your camps and generally begin to pull ahead of you in terms of farm, which causes a snowball effect, allowing them to get even further ahead, finishing their items quicker than you and leveling up faster than you, until it is impossible for you to fight them. Avatar's Parachute is a large power spike, but a delayed one, making it much less valuable than it appears. Relative to the enemy ADC who didn't build avatars, you will be a lot weaker than them for a lot longer, giving them a much better chance of pulling ahead of you early and winning the game. This is where we can use the term power curve. While the power spike of Avatar's Parachute is high, its delay on coming online gives it a weak power curve. So a power curve is a function defined by the DPS of finishing an item and considering how much time or how much gold it took for the item to come online. Now let's plot the relative power curves of each of these items on this graph by considering the DPS of the ADC with this item divided by the cost of the item. We can see how much things have changed now, with avatars falling to one of the weakest power curve items you can buy. This is one of the reasons you won't see pro players buying it first item. The maths here speaks for itself. Sunbeam Bow has shot right to the top. It is one of the cheapest damage items in the game, and it is the second highest damage first item an ADC can build, meaning its power curve is insanely strong, and now that it has been buffed, should definitely be considered as a first item, especially as it has the benefit of scaling insanely well into the late game, appearing in many of the top damage full builds. Sunbeam Bow does have the disadvantage of draining your mana, which may make it less favourable for some players, and you also may not want to have it active when you're farming buff camps and minions, meaning it slows down your farming slightly when compared to an item like Braggy's Heart. If you don't want Sunbeam Bow, Kins is the next best power curve item you can buy. Again, this scales well into the early, mid and late game because its damage only increases as enemies obtain more health, making it a solid first item pick, but it also has the disadvantage of not proccing its effect on minions and buff camps, making it less effective for farming. Braggy's Harp is the next best power curve item for an ADC. It again scales fantastically into the later stages of the game, and its damage increases as you level up, making it a solid first pick. Braggy's Harp's effect also procs on jungle monsters and minions, increasing your farming efficiency and giving you a good farming advantage that could help you snowball over the enemy team. After those items, your options are quite scarce if you're building solely for damage. Brace of Radiance is definitely strong once stacked, but stacking it can be difficult, and you won't have the extra auto attack damage when not hitting enemy gods, making it extremely weak for farming. You will spend a long time doing your buffs and clearing waves, allowing the enemy ADC to take advantage of that and invade your jungle or even rotate while you're busy. Farming fast is really important because you don't want the enemy ADC to have the free time to run around the map and take the extra XP and gold. Pressure on the enemy team is super important, and that is gained through high damage to both gods and non-god enemies. We also have to consider lifesteal, which is usually brought early by ADCs as the sustain is valuable in lane, and core ADC lifesteal items like Devar's Gauntlet and the Reaper must be stacked, meaning you likely want to buy them early. With that in mind, let's look at this graph again while considering lifesteal items. When we just consider DPS, the lifesteal items fall far below the other items we've discussed, with Bloodforge being the highest DPS lifesteal single item you can get in the early game, hovering around 120 DPS, about a 20% decrease in damage when compared to Sunbeam Bow and Kins, which is a significant amount, but Bloodforge does have the added sustain and active component that might sway you towards it. I'm also showing you Transcendence just to give you an understanding of how other items stack up against the highest DPS items. I've given both Transcendence and Devar's Gauntlet 10 stacks when considering them for a single item power spike. The Reaper and Devar's Gauntlet fall really low on this list, so your DPS will be very lacking against an enemy who has gone Dagger of Frenzy, Sunbeam Bow, Kins or Braggy's Heart. You should always try to bear in mind what the enemy ADC has built and be aware of how your damage will compare. This will allow you to understand when you should be aggressive versus when you should be playing more passive. Devar's Gauntlet and the Reaper are very low DPS items, and when we run the power curve analysis on them, we can see they still don't fare well. But once these two items are stacked, they do become the most powerful lifesteal items for ADCs. So you're trading your early game power curve for a better mid to late game curve, which I'll show you later. We can also see that Dagger of Frenzy is fairly low on this list, coming in at the 9th best first item for ADCs. But this graph doesn't consider its active component. When active, Dagger of Frenzy has a DPS of around 175 and outclasses every other item on this graph, making it a solid first item choice. And when we look at the power curve for this single item, it shoots far above the others, but you need to make sure you're playing around the 15-second cooldown and fighting the enemy ADC only when it's available and active. So now we've considered your best single item, but what about an ADC's best combination of two items? Notice how I didn't say best second item, because that's not the question I'm currently asking. What I am asking is, what two items are best on ADCs, regardless of what the best single item is? For example, Avatar's Parachute may give the best single item power spike, and Sunbeam Bow gave the second best power spike. But does that necessarily mean that the best two item combination will be Avatar's Parachute and Sunbeam Bow? Or will the interactions between items, and the fact that the ADC has gained attack speed and basic attack damage from leveling up, have an effect on the best combination of two items? Here are the top 10 DPS combinations of two items for ADCs when hitting an enemy ADC at level 10. Avatars and Sunbeam is a solid combination. with Sunbeam Bows active benefiting greatly from Avatar Parachut's high strength. But interestingly, a really close second is Kin's and Sunbeam Bow, a much cheaper alternative, having a difference of 1000 gold compared to the top option, meaning this combination comes online much sooner. The fact that both Sunbeam Bow and Kin's scale with attack speed, and that they both provide attack speed, makes them a really strong combination of items. Sunbeam Bow then appears in the next top 2 DPS combinations. Before this patch, Braggy's Harp and Kin's were the highest DPS combination, but the extra 10 strength and intelligence on Sunbeam Bow this patch has elevated it greatly in terms of DPS in the early game. You can see the next best combinations for yourself. We're basically just looking at different combinations of Avatars, Sunbeam Bow, Braggies, Deathbringer and Kin's. This is great news for ADCs, because we know the best single item combinations match up well with the best 2 item combinations. So we know we can build Sunbeam Bow into Kin's for example, and have a great 1 and 2 item power curve. Now let's run the power curve function on these items. Avatars and Sunbeam has fallen off hard, showing us just how unviable Avatars is in the early game. Kin's and Sunbeam has the best power curve, meaning mathematically Sunbeam Bow first into Kin's second has the best power curve of any 2 items that we can consider, and you don't have to sacrifice your 1 item curve in order to have the best 2 item curve. Deathbringer and Sunbeam Bow appear surprisingly high on the power curve analysis, despite Deathbringer's high price. Braggies and Sunbeam Bow is the second best 2 item curve you can buy, and will be slightly advantageous for farming over Sunbeam Bow and Kin's. If you really don't like Sunbeam Bow first item, your next best option is Kin's and Braggy's Harp, doing solid DPS for a low price. After that, the numbers fall off quite a lot. So I'd say these 4 combinations are what you should be aiming for, with Sunbeam Bow in your first item slot. Now let's look at 2 item combinations with lifesteal. I've put these 2 combinations here because we have just determined they are 2 of the best, and it gives you something to compare the lifesteal builds to. Lifesteal really suffers when we look at DPS for 2 item power spikes. The best 2 item power spike you can have with lifesteal is Bloodforge and Sunbeam Bow, and from the graph we see Bloodforge has a much higher DPS when we consider 2 item spikes with lifesteal, appearing in the top 4 DPS item combinations that contain lifesteal. Building Bloodforge will give you about a 20% DPS drop when compared to building no lifesteal. For 2 item power spikes, I placed Devire's Gauntlet at 30 stacks, and we can see it suffers greatly compared to building no lifesteal, and is still much worse than Bloodforge. The Reaper is even worse, but I've assumed no stacks here, so take it with a grain of salt, but it is definitely a risky item to build. If we do the power curve analysis on these items, Bloodforge and Sunbeam Bow contends really well, and so does Bloodforge and Kin's or Braggies. Overall, if you build lifesteal, you should be pairing it with Sunbeam Bow or Kin's for the best 2 item power curve, regardless of which lifesteal item you have actually brought. Now again, I'm not asking what the best 3rd item is in this section, but what 3 item combination does the most damage. Now that 3 item slots have been filled up, could we see Deathbringer, Demon Blade and Mushami's dual swords in the top slot? It would make intuitive sense to me that this would be the case. With high crit chance and strength, surely those 3 items would do well against the enemy ADC. Here is the DPS graph for the best 3 item combinations. There is actually a surprising lack of crit chance appearing, with the top DPS builds against the enemy ADC being yellow damage items, which is surprising. The fact that all 3 of these items have attack speed and yellow damage means they pair well together. As you move down the list, you can see Kin's, Sunbeam Bow or Braggies appearing in all of the top combinations. If we look at the power curve analysis, the top DPS build stays at the top, meaning not only is it the highest possible damage 3 item combination, it is also the most cost effective, making it very desirable. From this and what we've seen so far, I'd say Sunbeam Bow first, Kin second and Braggy's Harp third is a solid build path. If you're playing solely for the best possible power curve, and trying to take advantage of your power curve by playing aggressively in the early game. The only issue with displaying the best item combinations the way I am now, is that we're only considering the power curve up to this specific point of having 3 items, and not what we want our late game build to look like. But fortunately, all of the best power curve items also have a solid late game, but do they have the best late game? If you're asking yourself this question, just bear with me through a few more graphs. Later, we'll be looking at late game builds and their ideal power curves. If you want to start transitioning into crit here, you can, with the second and fourth best power curves for 3 item combinations both containing Deathbringer, even after we consider its large cost. We also have the third best power curve for 3 items containing Kin's, Braggy's Harp and Odysseus's Bow. This is appearing because of how cheap Odysseus's Bow is, bringing this combination of items up when we consider the price. I'd say if you went back to base and had just enough gold for Odysseus's Bow when you already had Braggy's and Kin's, you should at least consider Odysseus's Bow. It provides solid damage when paired with these 2 items and has a great power curve. It also increases the speed of your farming. Another thing to mention here is that I have modelled Demon Blade to be only half stacked, which seemed like the most reasonable way to model it. But of course, if you get lucky and get a crit to stack the item, the Demon Blade builds would be appearing higher up on the list, and so would other crit builds in general that contain Demon Blade. So take these numbers with a grain of salt, but on average, these builds will be doing the most DPS for the cost of the items. I could say similarly that Sunbeam Bow is only modelled at half of its damage potential, and that still appears to be the best power curve item you can buy. And Odysseus's Bow has been modelled to never bounce, only proc on the target it hits every 4 auto attacks. But if you're against 2 enemy gods and they're close together with Odysseus's Bow bouncing between them, Odysseus's Bow would be the highest DPS item in this list. So remember, these are average damages. For lifesteal builds, Devar's Gauntlet is now the best option because it is now fully stacked, with Bloodforge not far behind. Having lifesteal in your build now only decreases your damage by about 15%, compared to if you had gone no lifesteal. If we run the power curve analysis, the results are unsurprising, with Sunbeam Bow, Braggy's and Kin's being good pairings with any lifesteal item. Deathbringer is also a solid choice as shown by the second build. Now this is the last combination of numbers of items we're going to look at before we start to consider power curves for your best late game builds, and how going the top DPS build for late game might not be optimal for winning a game of Smite. For the best 4 item combinations, I've had to change the formula. Before, I was only considering hitting the enemy ADC, but at around 4 to 5 items, you might begin to rotate or fighting over objectives, where you'll come across the entire enemy team. So now instead of showing DPS on the Y-axis, I'm showing time to kill the whole enemy team. This standardizes the builds and makes them much more suitable to analyze. Now that we're looking at time to kill instead of DPS, the lower the builds appear, the more damage they do. So this top build is the highest damage combination of 4 items against the whole enemy team, when no enemies have spectral armor. A pure yellow damage build with Executioner is the most damage you can get from any combination of 4 items. This is quite surprising, as maybe you would expect for Dominance and Executioner to appear together in the builds now that we are considering hitting the enemy solo laner and support. But this isn't the case, and yellow damage items come out on top over penetration at this point in the game. Deathbringer in the combination is also solid, but more interestingly is the third build, which contains no penetration at all, but it is still really strong for killing the whole enemy team, even though I haven't allowed Odysseus's Bow to bounce. The combination of the yellow damage items, especially Kin's, with high attack speed means damage against all enemy types with this combination is high. Higher crit is also shown to be solid by the 9th build, and has an okay build path of Sunbeam, Kin's, Deathbringer into Demon Blade. Now let's do a power curve analysis for each of these combinations. The third build has the best power curve, coming in with a super high damage and a really low cost. The yellow damage builds are far superior to crit builds once we consider cost, and actually also do more damage than the crit builds at this point in the game. I should also mention here that Pon said on Titan Talk that Titan's Bane would be getting 25% penetration again, but would be over 3000 gold. So I have preemptively added it to my simulation at 25% pen and 3400 gold, but this may change at a later date. Okay, finally, let's move on to how we can fit all of this information into how we should build overall. First, I need to explain to you that I have now built a build order algorithm, and for you to understand the rest of this video, I need to quickly explain how it works. In my past videos, I have never considered build order, and I just calculated the highest damage late game builds and displayed them to you like this. The order of these items is almost random, because I had no way to determine which items should be built in what order, but my new algorithm takes these best late game builds and looks at each item in them. For each item, it looks to see which one gives gives the best power curve for the first item. So in this case, it would choose Sunbeam Bow, because the graph I showed you earlier showed Sunbeam Bow had the best power curve of any item when built on its own. The algorithm then locks this item in as item 1. Then it looks at the rest of the items left and picks the next best item based on the best 2 item power curve with item 1. So item 2 would be chosen as Kins, because Kins is the best 2 item power curve possible out of these items. It then goes again and picks the best 3rd item power curve item with items 1 and item 2. So in this case it would be Braggy's Harp, and so on until there is only 1 item left that must be chosen in the 6th item slot. Essentially, the algorithm finds the best possible power curve for any 6 item build I place into it, which might not be optimal. Maybe you value having a bigger 4 item power curve over a better 3 item power curve, but my algorithm does not account for this, and it always optimizes for the best next item power curve after it has picked the previous item. Now, all the builds I show you from now on are ordered as I just described, optimizing for the best power curve. I've generated graphs to show the power curves for all of the builds we usually look at. So with average DPS on the y-axis and cost on the x-axis, we can see how the builds fare up compared to each other at different points in the game. You can think of the x-axis as cost, but you can also think of it as time, as you gain gold over time. But it can be distorted as you start to consider the amount of farm the ADC is getting, so bear that in mind. Here is our first build we're considering. The final build is Sunbeam Bow, Kins, Odysseus' Bow, Executioner, Deathbringer and Titan's Bane in that order. And each blue dot shows the amount of damage you'll be doing once you get the item at that dot. Again, my algorithm ordered this to mathematically give the best power curve you can get for any given build. You might notice the graph plateaus at Executioner here. That's because it's gone from considering DPS against the enemy ADC to DPS against the whole enemy team. There is also a large gap between Executioner and Deathbringer, and that's where I allowed the simulated hunter to gain their starter item, so the DPS and cost gap is due to that. Now, here is that build and its stats. Notice the blue bar. That relates the build to the colour of the dots. So for the blue build, follow the blue dots. Now let's look at another top DPS late game build, a much more crit focused and expensive one. This is a solid late game build, but we can see from the graph that the build path is rough. All of the items but Kins in this build are weak in the early game, making it difficult to determine in what order you should build the items. Now we can compare the power curves of these viable builds. We can see from the curves just how much weaker the red build is when compared to the blue build at all points in the game. For instance, all of the blue dots are higher than the red dots, meaning obtaining the blue items is always a bigger damage spike than obtaining the red items. We also see the blue dots are further left than their red counterparts, meaning the blue items are cheaper and so come online sooner in the game. The blue build power curve is much better than the red one, even though these builds are both super viable in the late game. Let's run through 3 more builds on here. Each colour on the top represents the colour of the dots. The green and yellow builds are both lifesteal builds, but they show very different power curves. Before Devar's Gauntlet is stacked, in the first dots, the green curve is much lower than the yellow one, showing how good Bloodforge is as a first item with lifesteal. If we look at the second item dots, we can see the yellow curve is still higher, but once we move to 3 items and beyond, the green curve starts to vastly outpace the yellow curve, showing just how good Devar's Gauntlet is when stacked, and how lifesteal items are more efficient in a yellow damage build. I hope this shows you how you should be playing the game based on your current build and what build you're aiming for in the late game. If you build Devar's Gauntlet, you should be aware that you probably get out damaged by the enemy ADC before you stack it, but once it is stacked, you'll be doing much more damage and you should play around that power spike. This also goes the other way around. If you notice the enemy ADC has a weak build path, which you can now recognise after this video, you should attempt to be aggressive and begin to build a lead. I now want to show you a multitude of different builds and their build paths and power curves. This way you can see how what you usually build compares to other builds, and what order you should be buying items in. If we start with Sharpshooter's Arrow's top builds against enemies with Spectral, here are the top 5 builds, their build paths and their power curves. Not only does the blue build have the highest overall DPS late game, but it also has the best power curve. The yellow build is solid late game, but the build path is so weak in comparison to the blue one. It's extremely awkward fitting Deathbringer, Executioner, Demon Blade and Titan's Bane into a build, because the power curve of those items is so weak in the early game. So they were the best builds against enemies with spectral armor. Here are the best builds against enemies without spectral armor. The blue build has the highest damage overall and seems to have the better power curve. This is really surprising as this build contains only Deathbringer and Sharpshooter's Arrow as its crit items, even though the enemy doesn't have spectral. If you compare the blue build to the purple build, which is a more crit orientated with minimal yellow damage, the mixture of yellow damage and crit in the blue build is shown to be much more powerful, both at the end of the game and throughout it. These top builds could be tainted by the fact that I've given Titan's Bane 25 penetration following from what Pond said on Titan Talk, which could be making yellow damage items seem more favourable. It's yet to be seen if or when this change will actually take place. Just in case the change doesn't take place, here are the top 5 DPS builds that don't contain Titan's Bane. You should look to build them in the order they appear in the images. You can see yellow damage and crit is still super strong, even when enemies don't have spectral. I think there's some old concepts being dragged from Smite 1 to Smite 2 when it comes to building. My code is showing that yellow damage and crit in a build is super high damage, even when Oboe never bounces, so don't feel bad about building yellow damage and crit items in the same build. We can see the yellow build has the best power curve, but it is slightly lacking in late game damage when compared to the blue build. But the blue build does have a much weaker power curve during the mid game, where transitioning into crit feels clunky. Let's quickly look at the power curve of certain builds. Here are the top DPS builds for Sharpshooter's Arrow with Lifesteal. Again, the builds are quite similar, with Devar's Gauntlet being much weaker in the early game when compared to Bloodforge. With only Kins for yellow damage, the purple build has the worst power curve. Again, if Titan's Bane doesn't get buffed to 25% pen, you can replace it with Dominance. So I think that's enough to see that in this patch, yellow damage builds with some crit are superior, for both late game damage and for your power curve. I just want to quickly show you a variety of good final builds for Hunter's Cowl when the enemy doesn't have spectral. These are all viable late game builds, but when we look at the power curve for each of them, there are large differences. The blue build is the highest possible damage and also has the best power curve. The red build really isn't far behind. We can see the Bloodforge build starts off strong compared to the yellow Devour's Gauntlet build, but it really begins to fall off after you get your third item. So now you know exactly how your build path affects your damage throughout the game, and as a bit of fun, what if we constructed a build that focused purely on power spikes and forgets about late game damage? Then we would have Sunbeam Bow, Kins, Braggies, Odysseus' Bow, Executioner and Titan's Bane. And that build would give you the best power curve possible out of any build in the game, but will be slightly lacking in the late game. And that's everything from me. If you have any questions, please ask. I made a ton of graphs, so I'm just going to leave them all playing. They'll just show a bunch of optimal late game builds and their power curves. Thanks for watching, and remember, don't guess, do the math.